Lineage Series, Book 1, Chapter 1. It was the heat that woke them. The pleasant crackling of a fire in early spring had quickly become the deafening roar of a voracious monster. Flames rushing along the thatched roof made quick work of the parched rushes and gnawed at the skeleton latticework. Charred thatching rained on the monks inside, who struggled through smothering smoke to escape the dormitory. One monk grabbed 2 coughing companions and, casting aside Monk's decency, threw them out the hut before turning back for others. He stumbled between the cots in the ashy dark to usher out another 2 who had become lost in the smoke. He turned back to grab the last from the farthest corner. The final 2 monks neared the door when, with a loud moan, the lattice beam fell, blocking their escape. Roaring fire and screams of terror had awakened the other dormitories, and monks arrived with buckets from the cistern and damp blankets to combat the flames. But there was nothing to be done for their trapped brothers. In the utter chaos, flickering light from the blaze blended dancing shadows with human movement. With no moon to betray him tonight, and nearly all of the monks combating the fire, a black-clad intruder became only one of 1,000 shadows that darted among the temple. The watch, merely a novice disciple, came running to see the commotion, and did not immediately notice the intruder who passed him. When the boy turned, the intruder made a grab for his neck to pull him backward off his feet, but the boy managed to twist his body and mount defense, and further chaos ensued. With the abbey under siege, a woman ran to the main shrine. She avoided the 2 fighting before the temple and slipped through the doors left cracked by the hurried watch. Directly across the room stood the altar where the scrolls lay in a silk-lined box, and she hesitated now only because the shadows may hide others who had thought to go for the scrolls. Silently, she ran to the altar, thinking only to keep the scrolls from the intruder as she wrapped them in a black cloth. The doors flew open, striking the walls, but the flood of light fell short of the altar. Beyond a glimpse of a black figure with the hilt of a sword over his shoulder, the woman did not wait to see who had entered. She ran hunched over along the line of darkness between the wall and the faint light the windows cast on the floor. At the end, she pushed open the last window and jumped out, but it snapped shut and bounced against the frame. Hearing the snap, the man ran to the altar to find the scrolls gone. In a thundering panic, he sprinted to the window and vaulted through it to the back Bailey training ground, where a dark figure dashed into shadow. Though he ran nearly as lightly as she, the grinding of gravel behind her told the woman he was closing in, and she could not outrun him in the length of the Bailey. She veered off to the right, away from the old cart she had planned to use to vault the wall, and sprinted for the closer tree branch that hung over the wall. Still, he gained. With the fire and the commotion at the front of the temple, no one was paying attention to this remote area. The 2 were isolated, and there was no choice but to fight. As the man drew closer, she suddenly threw a back kick, but he skipped back just enough. With a switch of her feet, she turned and grazed him with a snap of her leg, making him stumble. She turned again for the branch, but heard him regain his footing, and when she jumped, the man leapt with a wild grab that failed to seize hold, but succeeded in knocking her aside. She immediately pivoted, a savage animal ready to face her opponent, who had found his feet, although he stayed crouched. They rose, standing several feet apart, staring at each other's dark figure. She led with a side kick, quickly countered by a sweep at her supporting leg, but even mid-kick she jumped and landed immediately ready to block his set of rapid punches. As he punched, the woman tried to kick out his knee, but he pulled back. Her left hand reached for his neck, but he pushed her arm down and grabbed it. The move left him open for a punch, and she took advantage by pulling her left arm and jerking him into a knuckle punch to the solar plexus. He barely deflected the blow as he fell forward, but she immediately countered by popping her left shoulder into his chin. Even as he stumbled, he pulled his broadsword from its baldric. In response, the woman drew her shorter sword and flipped it with a flick of her wrist. Stepping into a back stance, she drew the sword so the smooth back of the blade was level with her eye. She extended her right arm, hand held tight with index and middle finger up and the other 2 bent down, thumb tucked closely to the side. "Give me the scrolls," the man demanded in the common tongue. "Note," she refused in Sena. The man froze in astonishment. This stranger knew the language of the monks, but who would know that? Taking his lack of response as a lack of understanding, she spoke in the common tongue. "Come and get them." Fine, he accepted her challenge. Their swords clashed with as much success as their unarmed combat. While each could manage a small attack that antagonized their opponent, Neither could land a damaging blow. Finally, he blocked her sword by pushing it to the ground, but the woman was quicker and elbowed him in the jaw. As he stumbled, his sword ran up the edge of the woman's blade and glanced off the crossguard. His blade came down on her left wrist, slicing through the tendons. Blood peppered the sandy ground. Her limp hand dropped the sword, and a short cry escaped before she could silence it. She knew silence was protection, so the woman bit her lip as tears of pain trickled down her face. The man regained himself, and taking advantage of the woman's pain, kicked out her legs. As the man pressed his sword against her face, she looked at him in hatred, yet she could not even see the face of the man she wished to kill, who was about to kill her. In the darkness of the night, neither of the two fighters had once seen the face of the other, but that did not matter. "Are you ready to give them to me?" he demanded. "Never," she replied through clenched teeth. "Hey!" a monk shouted from the entrance to the bailey. "What's going on?" he asked. The monk had heard voices and the clashing of swords. However, under a new moon, only the single standing figure was discernible. The woman was hidden in deeper shadow of the trees. The man turned back from the woman, leaving his sword pressed against her face. He shouted back, "It's all right!" But it wasn't. As he spoke, her right hand seized her sword, sweeping it up. The broadside struck his arm, and the low ridge of the triangle blade cut deep enough to slice open his sleeve and cut his arm. She sheathed her sword as she ran for the cart in the far bailey corner. Her left hand pressed tightly against her as she jumped on the cart, grabbed the top of the wall with her right, and vaulted over. The man sprinted over and jumped the wall into the wooded darkness. He scanned the forest, but darkness made his lone search hopeless, so he climbed the tree and used it to jump back into the bailey. More monks had now arrived, and as the man landed before a cluster of confused monks, he immediately began shouting orders to search the area. The others sprinted off to mobilize, but one remained. "He got away?" the remaining monk asked solemnly in Sena. "Male." The man who fought confirmed his fellow monk's fears. While the pitch of his opponent's voice made him question the male pronoun, he did not have time to debate it now. The second monk jogged along the first's steady stride, and between calls to action inquired about the intruder's identity. "Thronath," the first replied. "Darkons." The other monk stopped, silent in dread. Their rival had stolen the seigneur's most valued and dangerous possession. "You're sure?" "I don't know. He spoke Sena," the first monk answered. "What Darkon can do that?" Moss climbed the trees and hung like dripping water that stained everything dark green. The young woman, a black shadow on green, rode through at a canter that stirred the branches in her wake. Everything about her clothes, eyes, and pulled-back hair was dark. Use had worn the hem of her sleeve ragged, bare thread showed at her pants knee, and her cracked leather boots hung limp with age. No supplies, not even saddlebags, weighed her down. There was only her sword and the bag on her back. At a fork in the path, indiscernible to the untrained eye, she left the road to duck through a break in the wall of trees and bracken. Suddenly, the brush opened in a vaulted ceiling of greenery, an arched cathedral high enough for her to ride sitting straight in saddle. The slanted tunnel, gently leading down into the ravine, stretched for a quarter-mile before it came to a twisted maze of boulders. Two megaliths, taller than she on horseback, formed the labyrinth entrance. Thousands of years ago, hands had carved these stones into enormous pillars to welcome or forbid the entrance of any outsiders, but the weathered marks were now faint. Beyond the two welcoming standing stones, most of the boulders stood no more than waist or shoulder high on foot, but they tumbled on top of one another to form towering walls. The once respected guardians of the great forests of Croyant had been unquestioned by any, but after a centuries-long fall from grace, Darkons were now feared for the power they were no longer trusted with. Although travelers often hired them as escorts, because a Darkon's presence discouraged many thieves from attack, the Darkon approach of practicality over civility often outweighed their merits in the eyes of pampered rich employers. The average Darkon had become poor and willing to do any job society declared fit: thief, assassin, mercenary, anything respectable citizens would not do. The ravine home hid them from the world when isolation had become their one defense against human cruelty. Finally, the woman emerged from the boulders, onto a piece of shale-covered land by the edge of a large pool. The thin sheets of rock crunched like dried leaves under the hooves of her horse, Epon, as he drank from the glass-clear water, and the woman looked at her surroundings. For an extra 4 days, she had crisscrossed the country from village to village to throw pursuers off course, and after the necessarily prolonged chase, she was eager to get home. With a quick light pull on the reins, Epon turned from the water edge at a canter and jumped the small bank into the ravine forest, where another deer path ran. After riding at a canter for a mile, veering steadily toward the cliffs, she slowed down to a trot as she entered a large cluster of dead branches, vines, and bracken that domed over the path. The brush dome opened to a clearing framed by cliffs and stream, and filled with an open-aired market held by the small villages that dotted the tributary ravines. The merchants displayed their meats, vegetables, leather goods, and other wares, and even a small blacksmith set up shop for repairs. She rode a slow walk through the crowded clearing so as not to bump any of the workers weighed down by goods. The market fizzled out before a fork in the ravine. The stream covered most of the right fork that eventually joined the river valley where the farmers lived, and a narrow strip of land along the stream was the route most farmers and merchants followed to the weekly market. Ever steeper cliffs walled in the grass-covered left fork. At the top of the rock face, evergreen branches shaded the pass, and what beams of light did shift through the branches made every bit of dust glitter in the air. The woman headed down the left branch, where the wagon tracks ended. This pass did eventually branch off and connect back to the river, but the main part led to more remote places. The woman continued her solemn pace, passed only occasionally by a man or woman pulling a cart too wide to use the narrow fork. As she had the whole ride, she held the reins with only her right hand, while her left, wrapped tight in a scrap of cloth, rested on her leg. The only sound was the swaying of the trees, occasionally interrupted by the calling of birds. She knew several of the bird calls were warnings from the guards posted on the cliffs above. She replied with a whistle that was the reverse of the warnings, to assure she was no intruder. A mile of grass twisted on, until it came to an abrupt halt at the foot of a staircase penetrating the dead-end cliff, where the ravine met the crater wall of the Darkon's home. With a nudge of her knee, Ebon began to climb the stairs, with an echoing clop of hooves on stone. At the top of the stair, the cliffs had been carved away to form an open-air room, ceilinged only by the mingled branches of trees, and tangled vines covered the raw-cut walls. Straight ahead stood the entrance atop 4 broad, weathered steps, built by the stone cut away from the stairs. Left and right, there were low, rectangular pedestals, on which sat 2 gray half-breed wolves. The woman jumped off her horse and called the wolf dogs by name. "Daka! Mila!" And they came running. The half-breeds were guardians she had bred for more docile traits, and named one of the many tongues of Croyant. After petting the wolf dogs, she ordered them back to their posts, then took Epon's reins and led him into Haling. The tunnel through the mountainside to the crater made several right-angled turns to further slow down and nullify the numbers of any unwelcome visitors, before it opened to a plush lawn at a low point in the crater floor. Most of Haling lay on a smooth plain with tree-covered slopes rising in the north and northwest on an ancient scree worn down by time. Interconnected stretches of forest and small lakes dotted the crater floor, and woven in and around all of it were the homes of the Darkons. Near the entrance, a stand of trees screened the view of several buildings, making the sudden appearance of a packed gravel paddock and a full stable a surprise for newcomers. The stable was for storing tack and providing shelter for horses when they sought it, but the horses themselves were free to graze the neighboring clover-filled grove. As she removed Epon's saddle, she was keenly aware of the watching eyes that belonged to no Darkon. Sadie. The private soldiers of the Kospel elite had gained entrance to Haling as their lord's personal guard, but their numbers had swelled to rival the fluctuating population of transient Darkons. Her arrival had been noted, and would be reported. She should have reported herself first thing, but she was not inclined to pander to her current employer, no matter how high he thought himself. For most necessities, Darkons can rely on the ravine market or small sellers within Haling for more specific items, but some things could only be found by those who knew where to look. Although she trusted the apothecary as a competent man, for fresher and higher quality materials, she turned to a Darkon who personally knew all the effects of his merchandise. Urgard's hut sat nestled on a cliff hollow on the far eastern reaches of Haling. A mixture of smells from herbs, fungi, and nameless other hung in a pervasive cloud around his home, making the distant location apt. With a Darkon father and Sunaway mother, Urgard had had better social standing than most Darkons, and even attended Roar's University by hiding his paternity. He had once been an apothecary student at the forefront of medical discovery, but had tested a few too many of his own discoveries on himself, and he no longer quite fit in with normal society. Professors had mocked Urgard for his odd turn of phrase or other abnormalities of speech, and blamed them on his experiments. The young woman suspected it was only because he learned the common tongue late in life, a fact he tried to conceal, and therefore seemingly proved his critics correct, because she always found him sharp when she addressed him in the Darkon language. She did not worry about knocking, but opened the door and addressed a greeting to the murky darkness. Little light reached under the cliff overhang, especially near sunset, and the drying plants, hanging from rafters, shelves, and bracts, reduced the faint light until it would be nigh impossible for any except Darkon eyes to see. She wondered where Urgard would materialize from today. With a waft of pungent but not unpleasant smell, the curtain of herbs on her right parted, and a wiry, middle-aged man appeared. More hair covered his face than head, and some clumping strands of beard hung in loose braids dotted by flowers that were likely more accidental than ornamental. Beard hid his mouth, but a smile lit up his eyes as he returned the greeting. "Milan," he called warmly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need fresh stock. Boxy, Tamerlane, Dolus, Kype, and Fina," Milan said, catching the herbs she really wanted between a few innocuous ones. Urgard turned to where each herb hung, but at the end his face fell. "The others I have, but Dolus and Fina I can no longer carry," Urgard said regretfully. At Milan's furrowed brow he explained, "It's regulated. Drana Yerian declared it himself, but I'm sure it's Falsone's doing." Urgard gestured to the empty shelf at Milan's left. "You can only get it from him now. You must bow before Falsone to save your life. But you're not likely to need either of those just for stock, are you? You can get some on your next trip east, because you won't find it between here and there. Perhaps even bring some back for an old friend?" Milan's face fell for only a moment, as she contemplated what Falsone would ask in return for the disease-fighting herbs. She did not intend to find out. Milan forced a smile. "No, not likely. I'll see what I can do." Milan left the hut considering her options. What she needed lay unquestionably beyond her reach. Even if she set out now for the nearest source, her arrival would already be too late. Milan tried to turn her mind to better thoughts, but the sights around her brought little consolation. The entire length of Howling Crater stretched before her, giving ample opportunity to see the numerous changes Falsone's Sadie had wrought in her few weeks' absence. Sadie Watch stood near the outer cliffs, where no Darkon had felt need to keep watch before. The steepness and height of the former volcano's walls meant no sizable force could climb it and arrive in any fighting condition. Milan suspected the watch was less to keep anyone out than in. An empty scar stood out, where the old-growth forest had been thinned without usual Darkon care. Darkons routinely pruned dead and dire branches and started controlled fires to thin the underbrush and nurture the soil, but this patch had been stripped clean to feed the bonfires. Several squat, ugly brick buildings had appeared around one of the greens that served as the meeting places. While Darkons were master craftsmen at altering natural materials like wood and stone, they never built with such manufactured product as kiln-fired brick. The sharp lines and red brilliance of the brick clashed against the naturally irregular Darkon huts that blended in with the woods and cliffs. Little by little, The outside world that had been so cruel to them was seeping in, even to their last refuge. Milan had seen what he had done. There was nothing for it now but to deliver her report and face the man himself, the new patron, the new owner of the Darkhan Order.